I'm really excited. We're going to kick off today with two amazing folks and a different twist on the patient's story. We have Mike Grayab and his wonderful mom, Madeleine, joining us today. And many of you may have chatted with Mike and Madeleine over the last couple of days. Some of you may know Mike works with us in a lot of different ways. He's been doing all of our live streaming and has brought his technical expertise to the table to help us out over the years, and which we're deeply appreciative of. But I think their story is really interesting, and one that many also may have as an individual parent-child or mother-son in this case, and how they've navigated the disease and the challenges associated to it. So I'm going to bring Mike and Madeleine down. And this is Madeleine's debut. So here we go. So I don't really have any specific, questions because I know your story pretty well. And so Mike, do you want to start kind of with a little introduction, and then we can have your mom talk about her experience, and then we can have a conversation from there, if that makes sense.
Sounds good. Good morning, Susan. Good morning, everyone, and everybody watching from home. It's great to be here. And as Susan mentioned, we've been a part of the Cutaneous Lymphoma Foundation family since the fall of 2015. And my mom, this is my mom, Madeleine, and again, my name is Mike. I'm one of her 3 children, and the foundation's meant so much to us, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But it's really about her journey and what it's meant to all of us. So with that, Mom, we'll have you start to share your story, and then I'll jump in. Sounds good.
We have 4 children.
4 children, yeah, 4. I'm already off to the right start. Do we have her mic up loud enough? Okay, sounds good. Go ahead, Mom.
Hi, everyone. My name is Madeleine Grayab, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm honored to have been asked to share my story of hope with you. First, I'd like to thank Susan and her entire team, Cutaneous Lymphoma Foundation. They are a very important part of my story, as I will explain shortly. Let me start with a little bit about myself. I was married to my wonderful husband, Ed, for 58 years until he passed in 2021. Together, we raised 4 children in Connecticut, where I live. I'm 80 years old, and I consider every day to be a gift, so I live every day to the fullest. For the past 7 years, I've enjoyed complete remission and from Sezary syndrome, with no signs of cancer anywhere in my body, and for that I am forever grateful. But it was not an easy journey to get to this place. In the fall of 2015, I was diagnosed with Sezary syndrome for the first time. Prior to that, for several years, I experienced various forms of skin problems, but the doctors could not determine the diagnosis. At times, I would have patches of red spots on my back and arms, and sometimes they would be itchy. At other times, it looked more like a rash. I never had raised plaques on my skin. It was always flat. I'd find myself leaning my back against the wall to scratch and itch. I tried many over-the-counter creams, and the dermatologist that I saw prescribed steroids and methotrexate. At times, each of those would push back the redness and the itchiness, but it would always be temporarily. And the steroids made my skin thin, so I could only use those for a short period. I tried light therapy as well, and one time my skin was slightly burned during the process. Then after several years, my skin started to get more red and cover more of my body, the color of raw meat. And it became painful as well. One Christmas day, I was in so much pain that the next day I went to the University of Connecticut Medical Center for an emergency appointment. Finally, in August of 2015, the results of a routine blood test show that my white blood cell count had skyrocketed. So my dermatologist referred me to a hematologist-oncologist. He took a biopsy of my skin and ordered additional blood tests. Then he called to tell me I had T-cell lymphoma. He referred me to Yale University, which is a center of expertise for treating this type of cancer. He also ordered a biopsy of one of my lymph nodes, which was swollen. At that point, almost my entire body was dark red, itchy, and peeling. It was also very painful to have any clothing cling to my body, so I wore loose-fitting clothes. I was also concerned about scratching my skin because I knew it was my body's barrier to all kinds of infections. My husband and I had previously planned to go on a bus trip to the Mackinac Islands in Michigan, and I was determined to go on that trip. While on the trip, I was in a lot of pain, but still trying to enjoy the scenery and the places we were visiting. My husband offered to have us cut the trip short and go home, but I didn't want to do that. After I returned from the trip with my hematologist-oncologist, called to tell me that the cancer was also in my lymph nodes, which was very upsetting. With my husband and with my son, Mike, we immediately went to meet with a dermatologist at a treatment center that specializes in cutaneous lymphoma, which was fortunately was only about 30-minute drive from where we lived. That dermatologist told us I had Sezary syndrome. Then he told us that this type of cancer can be a roller coaster ride with lots of ups and downs and twists and turns. So he advised us to try not to get too high or too low with our emotions during the ride. For my treatment, he had me start on a combination of photopheresis and targetin. Coming out of the appointment, my goal was to find a way to get more quality time with my husband and family. I didn't know how much time I would get, but I wanted to obtain some amount of quality of life. Within a few days, I had one photopheresis session, and I started taking the targetin pills. Within a couple of days after that, I was in so much pain that I felt like my body was burning in an inferno. I didn't know if it was a side effect of the treatment or if it was the cancer itself, but it was excruciating. I asked my husband to call all of my 4 children to my bedside, one by one, and I told each of them that no human being should have to live with this much pain, and that they needed to let me go from this life. Each of them and my husband Ed were very supportive, and they got me an emergency appointment the next day with an oncologist who has treated many patients with Sezary syndrome. The oncologist took a look at my latest blood test results of my skin, and they told us that a more aggressive treatment plan was needed. She prescribed pain medicine to help temporarily alleviate the burning pain I was feeling, and she initially recommended romidepsin, which is a treatment that is approved by the FDA. But my son had done some online research prior to our appointment and had learned about a clinical trial for a new treatment called mogamulizumab. So he asked the doctor about that trial. The doctor responded that we should try and get me enrolled in that clinical trial if I met the qualifications. In the trial, they were comparing the effectiveness of a previous approved treatment called vorinostat to the trial treatment mogamulizumab. Every patient who was enrolled in the trial was randomly assigned to one or the other treatment. But if you were initially assigned to vorinostat, then your cancer got worse, you could switch over to the mogamulizumab. We were all really hoping that I would get assigned to the trial medication, but instead I was randomly assigned to vorinostat, so that was disappointing. Just before I started on the treatment, they took a baseline blood test and determined that about 48% of my white blood cells were Sezary cells. And the skin on almost my entire body was dark red, itching, and peeling. My toenails and fingernails had turned yellow and cracked. I was retraining water, so my feet swelled to the point where every morning my amazing daughter-in-law, Vivian, came over the house and put compression socks on each of my feet to help disperse some of the buildup and make me more comfortable. When I started on the vorinostat, I got very nauseous, and I started to lose the hair on my head. Also, I was shedding so much skin every day. I used to say that I looked like the abominable snowman. My husband, Ed, did such a great job every morning, starting at 6 a.m. before he got ready to go to work, brushing off the skin on my body that was peeling. I took lukewarm showers, then I put on wet pajamas, wrapped myself in bath sheets, and I waited 20 minutes while my skin was absorbing the moisture like a sponge. Ed would then put moisturizing cream all over me. Flakes of skin were everywhere, and he was constantly vacuuming the house to keep it clean. I couldn't regulate my body temperature, so I was constantly very cold and shaking unless I was under a blanket, and I had my husband keep the heat on in the house all the time. When I went to the hospital for my medical appointment, the nurses would give me heated blankets, and I'd wrap myself in those to keep me warm. After about 8 weeks of vorinostat, my skin was looking a little less red, but about 70% of the white blood cells in my body were Sezary cells. So my blood work was getting worse. I had also lost so much hair that I had bought and was wearing a wig. At that point, the doctor told us the cancer had progressed enough that I qualified to switch over to the mogamulizumab, and we all agreed with that plan. About a month later, I had my first and only infusion of mogamulizumab. I'll let my son share about my experience with that treatment.
You know, I still get emotional just reliving some of those moments, but, you know, I'm going to pick up the story from there. When my mom was about to get her first, and as she said, only mogamulizumab infusion, and I'll just share about that experience, and then I'll take a step back as a caregiver to share from my perspective, you know, what the journey's been like. But picking up where my mom left off, she suddenly qualified to switch over to the mogamulizumab, and for those who might not be familiar with that particular treatment, it's a monoclonal antibody that targets, like a targeted assassin, cells in the body that have specific markers on them. So it's basically going after the bad cells and keeping the good cells intact. And so we were really excited about it because we had seen the results published from the phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trial where people who had an extensive amount of cancer in their body, like my mom did, like 90% of them responded well. It eradicated most of the cancer in their blood, so we were really excited. So just before she went for her first infusion with mogamulizumab, I found some other patients who were in that trial, and I had spoken with some of them by phone. I tracked them down on the internet, I emailed, I called them. They were in some Facebook groups, and I got a hold of one in California, this wonderful lady named Yvonne. And became a great friend of ours, sadly passed away a few years ago. But she told me, look, I'm in the trial. When I had my first infusion, going into it, in my blood, I had 22,000 cells of Sezary per microliter of blood in my body, and the doctor said, that's a high tumor burden. And so what happened was, when she said, when I had my first infusion, my immune system kicked into overdrive. It was killing so many cancer cells so quickly that I had excruciating pain in my hips, I had nausea, I had a fever, I had chills, she said, and they had to rush me to the ER and offset the infusion reaction. And they did that, and within an hour I felt much better. So she said, and then my doctor on the second infusion slowed it down from a 1-hour infusion to a 2-hour infusion to give my body a chance to acclimate to the treatment. So she said, you might want to ask your doctor whether or not they can slow down your mom's infusion to 2 hours, because my mother had 50% more cancer cells per microliter of blood. Where Yvonne had 22,000 cells, my mother had 32,000 cells per microliter of blood. So I went to my mom's oncologist. I said, listen, this is what happened a month ago with this other patient. Is there any chance we could slow down my mother's infusion from 1 hour to 2 hours? She said, we have to follow the clinical trial protocol because they're trying to learn, so we have to follow the rules, but we'll keep her for an hour and we'll watch and make sure she's okay before she goes home. I said, okay. So my mom's oncologist was going to be away at a conference in San Francisco when we had the infusion. So I went with my mom. She had the infusion, no problem. She's having a sandwich for an hour. We're sitting there in the hospital. Everything's fine. We leave after an hour, and we're driving back from New Haven, Connecticut to Rocky Hill, where my parents lived, and we're about 25 minutes into the 30-minute ride home. And all of a sudden, she said to me, Mike, I'm feeling, maybe I lied down wrong on the hospital bed when I was getting the infusion. In my lower back, I feel a little odd. And I said, huh. And within about 30 seconds, she said, oh my God, I feel really cold. I got these chills. I feel nauseous. She said, I feel horrible. And it came on like a stage 4 hurricane, all the symptoms that Yvonne had experienced. So I called Yale from the car, and I spoke to the oncologist on call. They said, get her to Hartford Hospital rather than come back to Yale because you're closer to Hartford. She's having an infusion reaction. So we pulled into my parents' house. My brother Joe and his wife Vivian, who my mom mentioned, were there with my dad. And Vivian and I and my mother hopped back into my car, and we drove just around the corner, and we pulled over and called an ambulance because Vivian said they'll be able to get her into the ER faster than if we drive. So we pull over, we call an ambulance. I hop in the back of the ambulance, and I had the clinical trial binder with me with all the information about the trial. And I'm riding in the back of the ambulance, and the rest of the family's following in the car behind the ambulance. And the EMT in the ambulance is telling me my mom's vitals, and he gave her something to try to offset the reaction after he talked to Yale on the phone, the doctor. And so he's giving me all her vitals. I'm texting them to the family in the car behind me, and I'm also texting with Yvonne because she knew my mother would be having the infusion, so she was on call for us. She said, okay, remember, this is how they offset the reaction for me. So we pulled into the Hartford Hospital ER. The doctors met us. I opened the binder. I said, this is the type of cancer my mother has. It's called Sezary syndrome. It's a type of cutaneous T-cell lymphoma. She was just treated in a clinical trial with a monoclonal antibody called mogamulizumab, and she's having an infusion reaction, and they thought she might be having like Epstein-Barr syndrome, which it can look like, and said, no, this is a reaction to the infusion. And I said, this is how they offset it for this other patient. They're like, okay. So they used the same approach, and within an hour, my mom felt fine, was chatty with us. Her skin looked amazing all of a sudden, an hour later, and they ran a flow cytometry test, which for anybody who has Sezary syndrome knows, that's how a big test that you use to measure, how far advanced the cancer is. And basically, like within a couple hours after that infusion, 2/3 of the cancer was gone from her blood, and we were blown away. So Now, they said at Hartford Hospital, well, we'd like to admit your mom overnight because her blood pressure is still a little low. And I called the on-call oncologist at Yale, and I said, I don't want my mother getting kicked out of the trial. Is this going to be a problem for her to stay in the trial if she gets admitted to the hospital overnight? And the doctor said, look, you got to take care of what's on the plate right now. We can't worry about what's going to happen tomorrow with the trial. So if they want to admit her, let them. So we did, and they admitted her, and the night went fine, and she was released the next day. Unfortunately, 2 weeks later, when we met with her oncologist at Yale, she had found out that because of they considered that a grade 4 adverse reaction, she did get kicked out of the trial. And we were devastated. So then I called Susan Thornton because we had learned about the trial in the first place through the Cutaneous Lymphoma Foundation's website. What a godsend the foundation was from day one for us. And I called Susan. I said, is there any way we could appeal to the pharmaceutical company to get the treatment outside of the trial on a compassionate use basis? She said, well, I'll try. And she picked up the phone and called Kiora Kieran, who was out here in the lobby this weekend, and I went and thanked them when I saw the representative. And she appealed to them on our behalf, and they said, unfortunately, if Mrs. Graham has any more adverse reactions, we still have to report those to the FDA in the trial or outside of the trial. And we're trying to get the drug approved for everybody's benefit, you know, so we just can't afford to take that risk. That was a serious adverse reaction, so we can't do that on a compassionate use basis. So with that, we went back to the oncologist, and she recommended, well, let's go on the FDA treatment that I had previously recommended, romidepsin, and let's see how that does. So 2 weeks later, my mother went on the romidepsin, Istodox, you know, there's two different names, and within a month after that, the rest of the cancer was gone in her blood, her skin, and her lymph nodes. So that was March of 2016. She was diagnosed in September of 2015. March of 2016, her doctor said, you've achieved a complete remission. And one day at a time for 7 years since, no sign of cancer. I still get so emotional. What an unbelievable journey that was. And, you know, when the dermatologist at Yale, who also did an incredible job, you know, early on when we first met with him, and he said, it's a roller coaster ride. It truly was, you know, and, you know, just taking that step back, 2 weeks before my mother was diagnosed, as she mentioned, for years, she had all kinds of other diagnoses, dermatologists trying to figure out what was going on, like so many people who have CTCL. So, you know, 2 weeks before, though, when she was finally diagnosed with Sezary syndrome, I got laid off from a job for the first time in my career. Never been laid off before. I was working for a marketing agency in New York City, and they lost some clients, and I've been working with them for 10 years. They had to lay me off and some other people, and I was like, I wonder what I'm going to do next. I'm about to turn 50. What am I going to do? And then all of a sudden, 2 weeks later, my mother's diagnosed with this stage 4 type of cutaneous lymphoma. And it, you know, it was in her skin, blood, lymph nodes. I said, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to try to learn as much as I can to go from being afraid. I can either crawl under the blankets and say, oh my God, my mother's got a stage 4 cancer, what's going to happen? Or I can try to learn as much as I can, try to become engaged, bring in other family members, bring in the cavalry, and work together to try to become empowered, to become informed and engaged and empowered, to try to help as much as we can. We can't predict the outcome, but we can do everything we can to put it out there and try to help. And so that's when, you know, I started a group on Facebook for Sezary syndrome patients and caregivers. We now have, you know, more than 600 people in that group. Turned to the foundation to learn a lot more, and called and spoke with other patients, read about the trials and all that, and learned about stem cell transplants. I talked to some patients who had had stem cell transplants, talked to patients on all the FDA-approved treatments and the clinical trials, and that's when, it's like, wow, this mogamulizumab, look at the response rates among Sezary patients in the phase 1 and phase 2 trials. So that's why when we had that first appointment going in 1 week in, when my mother's hematologist oncologist had just told her, you've got T-cell lymphoma, didn't go any further than that and referred us to Yale, I was doing some research and I said, her skin looks like this. He said T-cell lymphoma. It looks like it might be Sezary syndrome, but it could be one of these other rarer subtypes. So I don't know. So I said to my parents before we went to Yale, I said, I think you might have something called Sezary syndrome. We're going to hear from the doctor today, but that's what you might have. And I knew in my mind stage 4 and all that. And sure enough, the dermatologist at Yale said, you've got Sezary syndrome. So he initially put her on, as she said, targetin and photopheresis for the first week because he didn't have her flow cytometry results from the University of Connecticut yet. She had the skin flare and everything else that we talked about. And when she had that skin flare that day and was in so much pain and she called each of us to her bedside, my mom said, you have to let me go. No human being should be in this much pain. It was the most devastating moment of my life. And I said to her, and I hadn't been to church in 30 years. She took us every Sunday morning. I turned to her and I said, it's in his hands. And she kind of nodded, went out to the kitchen, called Yale and said, we need an emergency appointment tomorrow with an oncologist. And that's how we got the appointment the next day. And that's when the oncologist, a wonderful doctor, Dr. Francine Foss, said, she was tossing around. Again, she hadn't seen all my mother's files. It was an emergency meeting, and she said, thinking about romidepsin. And I said, well, what about this clinical trial? And she said, oh, let's do it. My mother got in right before the trial closed, and thank God she did. But we started, there's a site called caringbridge.org, Caring Bridge, and it's just a site where you can blog about your journey. And it's you can write just a couple sentences. So I invited the family and friends so that we wouldn't have to text them and take phone calls from everybody, repeat ourselves. We posted on that Caring Bridge site so that we could post updates after every doctor's visit for family and friends to see. Just a couple sentences. Here's how it went today. Here's how her blood looks. This was a good day, not a great day, whatever it was, the ups and downs, the twists and turns. And family were posting messages of support. People were bringing meals. Somebody, a dear friend, she crocheted a wonderful Afghan for my mother to help her keep warm, and the neighbors brought soup and chili and other things over, and it was just unbelievable to see family and friends come together, and we tried to fuel their engagement by keeping them abreast. They were part of the journey. Every step of the way, we kept them informed and engaged so that they surrounded us with love and support. And her niece made a painting for her, all these different ways of love and support, the cards, the letters, the visits, the phone calls, everything you could imagine. And, my father was just unbelievable, every day doing what my mom said and so much more. My brothers, my sister, the extended family, friends, everybody in so many ways made such an impact, right, Mom, at every step.
Good.
Yeah, and but my mom was such a champ throughout every step of this because, so many things were happening, so many ups and downs. The varinostat, she wasn't responding. Her disease was getting worse to the blood, and but she was like a champ, freezing cold and just, so many different things. But she hung in there at every step and just kept going one foot in front of the other through those very dark moments. And then all of a sudden, in March of 2016, to have achieved that complete remission, we were blown away. And, every day since, and from that moment, she said in the beginning, her goal was to get more quality of time with my dad and with the family, and boy, has she gotten it. But we have not taken it for granted. So many times we've said, every day is a gift. We are so blessed. And, I went with her to so many appointments, so did my brother and other family members, and that car time on those trips were such a blessing, and we would say it to each other. Said, this is going to sound weird, but having a stage 4 cancer in a way was a blessing because it brought us closer together. We spent so much more quality time together that we would never have done. And we used those car rides to have deep conversations about life and light conversations. And we treasured that time together. I will treasure it forever. And I know my brothers and everybody else who was in those trips, you know, so it all is how you look at the journey. It's not the destination, it's the journey. And without the downs, you can't have the ups. Who wants just a flat road through life? I'm not saying anybody would sign up for this. I don't know that you would, Mom. But you were like Rocky Balboa, man. You kept getting knocked down and getting back up. So, you know, you definitely inspired me and so many other people in the family. So, you know, of course, I don't have to say it, but I say it all the time. I love you dearly. So there you have it.
I have no words. That's amazing. Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing. You know, there's hope, right? No matter how dark it might look. And I think your message, Mike, about community and family and friends, and that's why we're all here as well, because not everybody may have that opportunity to have the kind of support that you had, but we have the support here in the room, beyond the room, and that's why we're here together as a community to help and support, and you have done so much for other folks and sharing, and it does take, you know, it takes a village, right?
For
and
sure.
Being able and sharing and having the courage to share your experience and really can help other people as they may travel a similar or even a different journey with this disease, to know that they are not alone and that we are all here to help each other to move and to live every day, right?
Right.
As a blessing.
And you know, Susan, you know, as I said, we turned to the foundation from day one. That's how we got the info about the clinical trial and other treatment options and stem cell transplants. That's where the journey began and where it has been, lockstep, every foot of this journey. But, you know, I called Susan, you know, basically right after my mother achieved that remission, and I said, you know, we need to find a way to get more patients to be even more knowledgeable and more engaged in their own journey so that they can potentially affect the outcome. If you ask good questions of your medical team and you say, what about this or what about that? Can we consider this? You never know how it could potentially change the outcome. I don't know what might have happened if she had gone on romidepsin from the start. Maybe we'd have the same. I don't know, but I wouldn't want to mess with how it turned out. So I said, Susan, can we get together? I haven't really done live streaming, but I'd like for us to create webinars and bring in doctors and teach patients on what questions to ask and how to become more engaged and how to go from being afraid to empowered. And so I said, can we get together? And right away, Susan said, let's do it. She was in Philadelphia. I was in New York. We met halfway in southern New Jersey in a hotel like this one, remember?
Yes. Very vividly.
And
We were going to meet for an hour. I think we sat there for about 6.
exactly. Susan's like, oh my gosh. And, but it was great.
Was great.
It was, we were sitting out in the lobby of this hotel and we're just shooting the breeze and going through, and she said, let's do it. And then we started producing these webinars to empower other people, and the foundation, like I said, I can't say enough great things about you, Susan, and everybody on the foundation team. So we applaud you, and we are so grateful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I didn't know my face was going to be all over the internet after all of this time, right? It's like, oh my gosh. But hey, we did it, right? We didn't know what we were doing, and we said, let's figure it out. We'll figure it out. Let's give it a shot. Who would have known? And then, you know, we were so well positioned because we took that leap of faith back in, what year was that? You said 2016, right?
2017 or
2017, something like that. You know, so when the pandemic hit, we had already been doing live streaming and webinars and things. So we were way better positioned than some other smaller organizations that had only done live in-person programs. So we were able to pivot, you know, and then to grow and expand and take advantage of technology as it's changed and morphed, and, you know, hopefully in the future we'll do more, and trying to figure out better ways of delivering information in smaller bites because we're all a little zoomed out at this point, right? So, you know, and welcome anybody's anybody else's suggestions, ideas on how we can bring the information out in a better way so that it's usable and functional and practical. So, you know, like you said, Mike, you picked up the phone, we had a chat. It's like, yeah, let's go have a conversation. And then here we are all this time. And your mom's here sharing her story. And I know you've impacted people beyond, you know, it's that ripple, right? You throw the stone in the pond and the ripples go out, and you never know where they go or how many people they reach or whose lives you just changed today, next year, next month, you know, and that's really what it's all about. So thank you both so much.
Never, ever, ever give up.
Yeah.
I have a question from the online audience.
Great.
Madeline, are you still getting yoga? And if so, how often?
No, I only had the one infusion with the Moga, and then they threw me off. And they put me on the romidepsin, and it's the romidepsin that brought my cancer to a remission.
And you're doing it once every 9 weeks now, right?
Once every 9 weeks.
Thank you.
And living one day at a time. I don't worry about yesterday, because yesterday's gone. I don't worry about tomorrow. It hasn't come yet. I live for today. That's my motto.
And I know you told me you got the infusion through your hand, through,
Right,
Have
I
you-
do. I don't have a port.
had you always, is that how you've always
I've never
gotten
had
it
a
for
port.
8 years?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's just amazing.
I have a wonderful nurse, and
Yeah.
she's been with me all that time.
Okay, thank you.
She didn't want to get the port because we were worried about a risk for infection. So her veins are very hard to find, but her nurse is great finding them somehow.
Great. Questions, comments? You guys are so amazing. What a wonderful way to kick off our day this morning. Thank you both
Thank you.
so much
Thank you.
Thank you.
for everything. Bravo. Well done.
Thank you.